Good evening, everybody. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall. On behalf of Town Hall Seattle and our partners tonight at Finney Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream conversation between Jill Lepore and Margaret O'Mara. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences and beyond into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we can't do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if Zoom or YouTube fatigue hasn't fully set in, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. But back to tonight's event. The program will likely run an hour plus, followed by, I should say, let me rewind there, 40-ish minutes of conversation, followed by 20-ish minutes of audience Q&A that'll bring us in a little over an hour. Jill and Margaret will take questions from the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep them concise so we can get to as many as possible. Also know that you can view the event both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. Town Hall's adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Michael Denzel Smith with R.O. Kwan, asking big questions about what kind of country we want to be. Layla Lalami with Viet Thanh Nguyen about how it feels to be seen as conditional citizens as an immigrant. Senator Sherrod Brown in conversation with, County Executive Dow Constantine, discussing 8 progressive senators who changed America, all from his very desk in the Senate, on the Senate floor, Senate Desk 88. As well as appearances by Michael Ian Black, Howard Gardner, Jane Fonda, and the brilliant music critic Alex Ross, also a New Yorker writer, it's worth noting, in conversation with the equally brilliant Ann Powers. And in case you weren't aware, tonight's program isn't your only chance to hear from Jill Lepore this weekend. Tomorrow night, we're hosting a special benefit for Town Hall inspired by her Harvard course, The History of Evidence. We'll look at the history, or I should say we'll probably breeze through the history of Western Europe and the United States from the Middle Ages to the present, considering the evolution of what's considered proof and its implications for what we now consider truth. It'll finish with a conversation with UW's Hanson Hossein. If at the end of the night, tonight, you still want to hear more from Jill, please use the code TRUTH10 for $10 off the benefit price tomorrow night. What's so funny, Jill? You'll find plenty more about that event and most of the above at townhallseattle.org. All right, then. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Civics programs in particular are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wincombe Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight's event. When I'm thanking you all for your support, it's because we're grateful to you all for actually purchasing a ticket to this program. The response to COVID-19 has posed unprecedented challenges for nonprofits, and if you support Town Hall's mission to make ideas and inspiration accessible to the whole community, we hope you'll consider further support with a membership or by making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. Note also, this isn't an easy time for booksellers. Thanks to those of you who already picked up a copy. I want to offer thanks, I should say, to those of you who already picked up a copy of the book with your ticket tonight. But listen up, everybody else. Since we know you will want to learn more about, it's either Simulmatics or Simulmatics, we're just about to learn, and the fascinating and unsettling story told in If Then in greater detail than even this conversation, I urge you to buy a copy of the book here tonight through our local independent partners at Finney Books, using, again, the button at the bottom of your screen. Know that the first 200 books we sell are signed by the author, which is a rare and beautiful thing in this particular time of our history. All right. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper, class of 41, professor of American history and affiliate professor of law at Harvard University. She's also a staff writer at The New Yorker and host of the podcast The Last Archive, a kind of wisecracking 40s detective radio drama that answers the question, who killed truth? She's been writing for The New Yorker since 2005 on the subjects of American history, law, literature, and politics. She's been a finalist for the National Magazine Award and twice for the Pulitzer Prize, and she's the author of over a dozen books. A random sampling includes The Secret History of Wonder Woman, published in 2014, which was a national bestseller and winner of the 2015 American History Book Prize. 2018's These Truths, A History of the United States, which became an international bestseller and was named one of Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the decade. And her most recent work from 2019 was This America, The Case for the Nation. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. She writes and teaches about the history of U.S. politics, the growth of the high-tech economy, and the connections between the two. In addition to her opinion pieces in the Times, her writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, the LA Times, Newsweek, and more. Prior to her academic career, she worked in the Clinton White House and served as a contributing researcher at the Brookings Institution. And she is herself the author of 3 books and co-author of forthcoming editions of a widely used U.S. history college textbook. Jill Lepore's book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, which was long listed for the National Book Award for Nonfiction, I should mention, is the subject of their conversation together tonight. Please join me in welcoming Margaret O'Mara and Jill Lepore.
Thanks so much. It's so great to be here. And Jill, welcome to Seattle, or virtually welcome to Seattle.
Oh my God, I so wish I was in Seattle
Yeah,
right now.
well, it is, we've had a very smoky week in Seattle, but it is starting to lift, and everyone now has their AQI app on their phones that are busily checking.
This was the day you could go outside. This was
the day. Yes, this was the first day that my dog got a walk all week. I don't know about how many people on the line had the same experience. So I wanted to, we're here to talk about your book, but I wanted to just at the very beginning open up with the news of this afternoon that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died at the age of 87. And you have a beautiful piece that's now on the front page of the New Yorker online that folks can go and check out after this session that talks about her and her life. But I just wanted to invite you to, if you've written about her and thought about her, what do you think? What are you thinking about this evening, and how this relates to where we go from here?
It's not a wholly unexpected passing. It's a tremendous loss to the country, to the rule of law. I think it's an opportunity to really pause and think about what public service really is, and the kind of dedication that Justice Ginsburg gave to the cause of justice for the whole of her days. I had been thinking about, she was born when Eleanor Roosevelt became First Lady. That's a tremendously important span in a career that really is unrivaled in terms of seeking and institutionalizing and constitutionalizing equality between men and women before the law. And I bristled a bit, and have bristled a bit, about the celebrity and the sort of celebrityification of Justice Ginsburg. And I guess I suspect she was herself somewhat uncomfortable with it. And it has always struck me, what's strange about that is how few female intellectuals are public figures. And the desperation with which I think mothers of young girls kind of hung on to Ginsburg as this, becomes a kind of bauble doll hero. You want the button and the coffee mug and the T-shirt, and there are so many ways to appreciate the kind of intellectual and political and legal work that she did, that I hope that kind of deeper appreciation is, and I'm sure it will be, what is offered up in the coming days. Mm-hmm. The tragedy of it, just for me, and I suspect for a number of people who've already been, shaken by this news, is how swiftly this will move from an appreciation for this American's tremendous contributions as a public servant to a political battle of terrifying ferocity and general idiocy. Like, it's just really, I don't like we have a few moments to pause and, in this kind of John Lewis moment way. Yeah. And then we all know that this pile of bricks will be pushed off the top of a building that we're walking by and will crush us. with the grotesqueness of our political discourse. So that's an uplifting place to start, Margaret. Thanks.
Well, I think we probably, by the end of this conversation, will sort of arc back to the political now. But let's go back to, let's go to your book, which came out this week. It's just terrific. It's Mad Men meets Silicon Valley. And so I just wanted to understand, how did you come to this? Why, how did you, what drew you to the subject, and how did you find this company, which is an extraordinary story that hasn't been told before?
Yeah, and I think, as your work has shown, so much of the story of Silicon Valley hasn't really been told before. I mean, it's extraordinary. I think people have the experience of reading your book, The Code, of every page is a revelation. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that happened, and I didn't know that's where that came from, and they really did that then. And so much of that is, there just really hasn't been work in that field, but also, the sneaky guy in the movie who's like trying to escape through the woods, and he's walking and he has like a broom behind him and he's erasing his footprints as he goes. That's kind of how I think of Silicon Valley. Like, these guys are so committed to the idea that they have no past that they're constantly erasing it. It's really important to be like, ta-da, I just showed up here. Like, I was here and I'm brilliant. I never had a mother or a parent, and I just have these brilliant ideas. Give me money. Like, like, that's kind of how I picture. Okay, so maybe that's unfair. I'm sorry. There are many, many good people who do this work, but there's the mystique, the cult of the Silicon Valley, the male genius. Just, the kind of Peter Thiel, like, just pulls it out of his head. Like Elon Musk, like, I don't know, just they're kind of the fetishization. It's a kind of recycling of, the 19th century man of progress, the kind of Edisonian notion, right? Like the suddenly the cultural heroes in the United States in the latter decades of the 19th century were these men of progress. Or, I was thinking about how in 1960 Times Man of the Year is the men of science. It's like, okay, I guess, like, we'll just worship you. So I mean, all which is a long-winded way of saying, like, there isn't, we don't, as I think in the public discourse, have much of a history for the kind of work that's gone on in Silicon Valley, maybe from the 1990s forward. So I've always been really curious about that. And I came across this story when I had an assignment in 2015 to write an essay for the New Yorker. I was asked to write something on the history of public opinion polling, because polling seemed totally out of whack. Like, this was well before, this was during the primary season, when the polling, like, the number of polls that were done was like crazy. It was like an exponential growth from, the previous midterms. That just was, the polling industry has gone crazy, and polling had become quite unreliable. Everybody knew that polling was really unreliable, but you could still make a lot of money as a polling company. So the industry was booming. So it became clear to me that even though it was booming, it was kind of its last gasp, because it's being replaced by data analytics, predictive analytics stuff. Like, why would you, hire a bunch of college interns to call random strangers and try to get them to answer questions over the telephone late at night, when you can just figure out what people believe by tracking them online? So then I got interested in, like, where did that turn happen historically? Like, I just didn't, like, I see the history of polling, I see where polling is now, but there was like a missing piece. And I heard about, I read something about this company, the Simulmatics Corporation, that was known for having provided an election simulation to the Kennedy campaign in 1960. And I did, what any historian would do, like, where are the archives of this company? There are no archives of this company. That's both good and bad. Like, A, now I can't find anything else, but B, no one else could really have done this either. That kind of thrill you get. And then I went to MIT, where the papers of the leading scientific figure in the organization had been deposited by his widow. And most of the papers were there. I mean, I found a lot of other stuff else in other places. And it was just, I remember I sent an email to my editor kind of summarizing what I had found. And he said, and I never ignore his advice. And he just said sort of cryptically, perhaps there is a book in there. And I thought, oh no, because I don't really want to write about a, pioneering data science company who would want to write that book?
Yeah.
But then it got really interesting. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If I answer your questions at such length, we're never going to get through the evening. So I'll give quicker answers.
What's great about your taking on a data, first of all, historian taking this on, and that you're not a historian of technology per se, but you're showing this company and placing it in political context and social context and talking about who these people were. And you've got some great it's a great subject because you've got great characters, right? You have the people who are carrying this story forward are just you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
I mean they're extraordinary. Who was I mean, were there any kind of big moments in the archives where you're like, oh, look at this?
Yeah, there were a bunch. I mean, one was so the guy from a Columbia sociologist who really kind of did the original work, the kind of mathematical modeling of voting behavior that is the heart of the code that runs this machine. His wife, named Minnow McPhee, was fascinating to me for a whole bunch of reasons, but it turned out that she wrote home. She was from Colorado, and she was living in New York and raising her very young children while also working as a nursery school teacher to pay the bills because her husband was in graduate school trying to build this voting behavior machine. And she wrote home with great frequency and these incredibly colorful and deeply incisive letters. And her granddaughter had collected them all from different members of the family and transcribed them all. And so there came a day when she just sent me this document of this transcription, like hundreds of letters from, the incredibly brilliant and much beaten down wife of one of the most important scientists of this company. It was just really thrilling. I mean, it's such an act of trust when family members give you correspondence or, and there was something in every letter that was meaningful to me. The kind of stuff that, when you're working biographically, you're desperate for, like, the day that, the little detail, like all the wives at a kind of company retreat where they kept passing around Peyton Place, which is this kind of steamy, sexy, controversial novel from the 1950s. And it's like, of course they did. But like you can't, you literally can't make it up. Like you want that detail to have these women be real people. And so I was just so grateful for that. But the thing that was a real wow moment for me was when I was reading through the Adlai Stevenson papers at Princeton, and I came across a letter that Newton Minow, who was a good friend of Stevenson's and had worked on his campaign and is a very close advisor, had written after he learned about this project to provide campaign advice by way of an election simulation. And he wrote to the Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger just to express his concern about it. And he's like, look, this clearly should be illegal. It's certainly immoral. And I also don't think it can work. And it just kind of jumped basically he's being sent a proposal for Cambridge Analytica kind of thing in 1959. And, he's a good and upright and moral person. And he's also just like a no nonsense person. He just looks at it, he's like, we shouldn't do this. Like, this is wrong. And everybody ignores him and it gets done. And like, it creates the world that we live in now. But it was piercingly interesting.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And the Newton Minow of the vast wasteland of television, who later
Newton Minow who later goes on he goes on to be the chairman of the FCC, appointed by Kennedy. He has 3 young daughters. They watch a lot of TV. He spends a day home, like when the girls are sick, watching TV with them, and he gives a speech to television broadcasters. Like, sorry, like Gilligan's Island. Have you people watched this thing that you're putting out there? Like, he's responsible for basically the creation of PBS and later NPR. Like, he's an incredible hero. But he's the guy with his head screwed on, right?
Yeah. So I love, sort of the 1960 Kennedy campaign as the sort of the opening, the kind of the big break that Simulmatics has, right? And I thought it was so interesting thinking, I mean, anytime you put the tech in the sort of political context and remind everyone that these worlds have been interconnected for a long time, I think we get new insights from that. And you know, you write about how the Kennedy campaign, well, kind of, it was a stealth operation for the Kennedy. I mean, the Kennedy campaign was not saying, look at our amazing computerized strategy, which is such a contrast to, you know, think about Obama 2012 or 2008,
Right.
2012,
Move
and then
on.
Trump
Yeah.
2016. Yeah, like
Yeah.
we're so advanced because we're using these data analytics to run our campaign and to target effectively. I mean, what does that tell you about the you know, how politics, what do you think, what insight did you get into the Kennedy era through, you know, looking at how this company, you know, what it wanted to do and what it actually achieved?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, one thing to remember by way of like a large scale timeline framing is that when we talk about a computer in this era, 59 when they're doing the coding or 60 when they're providing the service, we're talking about a mainframe computer, you know, that occupies a giant room the size of, you know, the entire floor of an office building kind of thing. When we're talking about Obama, like by then there are smartphones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's well past personal computing into the, you know, the smartphone and the mobile phone, the mobile computer phone. So in the era of, you know, the late 1950s, there's an incredible cultural anxiety, like as no one knows better than you, about computers and their power, because they are owned really, you know, by the government. The Census Bureau has a UNIVAC, and by giant mammoth corporations. And so, you know, in an era that is deeply concerned with brainwashing because of communist propaganda, they seem to be too powerful. Like in the kind of man versus machine way, the machine is this giant electronic brain, and it, you know, it kind of feeds into all this kind of science fiction stuff, or fears of automation and the replacement of workers by machines. Just very different from, by the time of Obama, people are like, I'm liberated by my phone, you know, like, I mean, it's not true, but like, it's in fact the revert, like the smaller your phone gets, the more dangerous computers are.
Yeah.
But people kind of perceived it upside down, right? Like it's like these giant hulking things that we look now like, what's it really going to do to you? Look at that computer. But it was scarier. They were scarier then. I think people, you know, put a phone in a computer in their pocket and they think it's not hurting them somehow. But if it was big, like HAL in 2001, you know, you see that fear all the way through the 1960s. Yeah. But the other thing that I your question brought to mind, which I haven't talked about at all. I don't think I talk about the book. I had an idea that I would talk about this, but you would be a person to have interesting thoughts about this. I came to be really interested in how, so these guys were programming mostly in Fortran, and, you know, formula translation, like they're just trying to figure out, because they're trying to get a computer that can do mathematical work, right? So all of their syntax comes from mathematical proofs, right? So that's the if-then of, you know, or the go-to, like they're just line by line commands that come from math. And yet what they're aspiring to do is move toward an artificial intelligence. And so I just kind of got really interested in how what could be done by way of advice for politicians or manipulation of voters was constrained by the syntax of the language itself. So one thing you can do if you have a computer that can do a lot of calculations and run a program, like you can simulate infinite possibilities, right? Like that's a thing you can do. If this, then that. If this, then that. Like if Kennedy says, yes, I am a Catholic and I love the Pope, but I would not obey him, versus then this happens. And if Kennedy doesn't say that, then this happens. And that you can test out those simulations on different possible voters, which is how the program worked. They divided the electorate into 480 voter types. And then they ran simulations across 50 different possible issues. Like if that, which just happened, like that's what they did, and that actually is still what is done, is an artifact of what Fortran could do when it was written in 1956. When and its legacy is, we have micro-targeting, we have an electorate that is divided into demographic mini units who are told that our interests are all oppositional to one another. Like in a certain kind of way, like did the fact that if-then statements were really easy to use in 1956 mean that now we have this super hyperpolarized polity? Do you know what I mean? Like, is that, that's a thing I've really wondered about.
Yeah.
Like as a weird unintended consequence of the constraints of computer languages from the
Yeah.
50s. Somehow we're still stuck in that, you know, in that code.
Well, we're constraints of the binary, right? The zeros and ones, and either or, and the engineering thinking that I think the protagonists of your story exhibit, which is that if we have a computer, we're going to, you know, the answer to your political problem, the answer to your social problem, the answer to X is the tool, the computer. Then it wasn't on every desk, but later that techno-optimistic framing gets morphed into, you know, the computer shrinks down, it becomes individualized, we get connected by wires. This is going to be the mechanism. And yet, you know, look, software coding is a very, you know, it is a binary, right? If you have a bug in your code, you know, you have to have a sequence, and everything has to, but when it works beautifully, but it's very linear and it's very clean. And, you know, this, of course, the cult of the engineer has always been, you know, we had the man of the year, the scientists of 1960 morph into kind of the modern day engineering first culture of technology companies, large and small, where the engineers are the gods. And it, you know, the messiness of politics, the nuance of voter behavior, of the fact that we might not be binary, that we might fit into one demographic group, but not necessarily all think the same way, is a really difficult thing. And yeah, computers, you know, the simulations still operate on that. They're much more complex, they're much more sophisticated, but they're much more dangerous that way. I think you're right. I mean, when they were these massive machines, you know, there's always been this interesting combination of fascination and fear with which we've, you know, Americans in particular have approached technology. And one of the things I loved, and actually it was sort of a crazy rabbit hole, that one thing I didn't write about as much in my book, we all have those, you know, you write a book and there are things you don't, just like you said, there are things you didn't write about, was this broader debate about privacy that went on in the 60s, which you talk about in kind of the Kennedy and Johnson years, where, you know, what are the computers, what is the government trying to do with computers, and how are people pushing back against that? So you move, you move through the 60s, and then the action moves to Vietnam. Well, it moves to the Great Society in Vietnam. Can you talk more about how this, you know, again, these characters, what they did, how they appear, and how these computer simulations were being applied by the government in these other contexts?
Yeah, I mean, so it's important to remember, again, just to have a sense of perspective on what a data science company looks like in this era. The Simulmatics Corporation never had a computer. Like, that's just an expense they could not have borne, and really there weren't like a lot of computers around. They rented computer time. So it's a small corporation that's trying out a lot of things. And to me, what's significant is how they really do try out everything that now is the kind of the foundation. So I'll just kind of run quickly through so they do this election simulation for the Democratic National Committee and then the Kennedy campaign in 1960. Then in 61, they begin doing kind of consumer simulations for companies like dog food or shampoo or toothpaste manufacturers, to say, like, we have created an imaginary representative body of American consumers, and we can test product messages on them and advertising messages on them. That's fairly successful until all the big ad agencies get their own computers. Around about 1962, they all realize, like, there's a way to do this. They don't use the same program that Simulmatics is using, but everybody figures out this can be done. And even though a lot of industry people say, yeah, it's just bullshit, like, I'm still going to tell you which of these ads is a better ad based on what I think. They can charge their clients a lot more if they say they have all this data behind their ad campaign. Then they work for the New York Times. They do try to accelerate election coverage on election night. That project does not go well, and partly as a consequence of that, they've been looking all along to get contracts from the Johnson administration, first the Kennedy and then the Johnson administration, to do. These guys are all really devoted liberals. They really believe in civil rights. They really believe in what comes to be Johnson's Great Society program. They want, which is very data driven, right? Johnson's Johnson's programs require a lot of economic and social data. And so they do some of that work, but then the company's really failing. And one of the scientists is a really committed Cold Warrior and very pro McNamara. He's a defense intellectual, really believes McNamara is Johnson's Secretary of Defense, the former CEO of Ford Motor Company, a big systems and computer guy. And so Simulmatics opens up an office in Saigon where they're really doing, again, they don't have computers. Like the Department of Defense has computers in Saigon, but they're collecting data by doing interviews with Vietnamese peasants. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to come up basically with a model of the Vietnamese so they can understand what messages would be more persuasive, but they're also evaluating a big computer program that the Department of Defense has, the Hamlet data system in Vietnam. And then when they come back to the US, they work for the Johnson administration's Kerner Commission studying race riots, which is kind of, all of this work is sort of consistent in that, the big project of the Cold War, when you step back and think about it, other than the arms race, what was called the minds race, right, was how to figure out how to win the ideological war by coming up with a model of human behavior so that you could figure out what messages to send perforated through the perforated iron curtain that could change people's minds. And in order to do that, you needed to have a prediction of human behavior that was mathematical. It was kind of the idea of behavioral science under the terms of the Cold War. So all of these things, like figuring out, trying to counter an insurgency, and counter a communist insurgency, or predict a race riot in an American city, they're all kind of part, or persuade a voter to vote Democrat instead of Republican. They are all relying on the same basic set of ideas about human behavior and the quantification of human behavior and the reliance on these, highly self-mystiquing kind of work of these, the computer men, but all of which does involve like a great deal of aggregation of data, which is causing people a lot of anxiety in the United States. There's a great deal of anxiety about how much data the government has about you. So there are privacy concerns. They don't directly impinge on Simulmatics' own work because of the kinds of that it's working for. But it is absolutely swirling around the story that I tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's about the government is the bad guy too, which I think is so interesting. You said in 1962, I mean, during the 1960s, all the direct marketing companies, they're all industry is using this micro targeting or as micro as you can get with a mainframe. And yet the Privacy Act of, all the various legislation that comes out of this moment, the notable one being the Privacy Act of 1974, which is all about computers, but it's all about government computers. and industry is, is just let off the hook. And which is why we are where we are.
We get where we are. Yeah. I did an episode of my podcast about the debate in 1966 and 67 about the National Data Center. And I interviewed Arthur Miller, the great legal scholar, who he testified before the Senate during the National Data Center hearings. So just for people that don't know the story at all, we have the Library of Congress, which holds books, and the National Archives, which holds manuscripts. But the Johnson administration proposed a national data center to hold and then make normalize all the data across federal government departments, from the Social Security Administration, Veterans Administration, everything. And it seemed like a good idea. It was also necessary for the implementation, arguably necessary for things like the Equal Opportunity Act. Like, you needed to be able to have neighborhood information about economic discrepancies across neighborhoods in order to, or you need to have voting records, like to implement the Voting Rights Act. Like, actually needed to collect a lot of data to do these great society things. But during the hearings, people really freaked out and thought the government would use it. People said the only thing that's protecting our privacy is that the government has billions of records about us, but they're all scattered across Washington, and so they can't really know anything. And this guy from RAND came in, the guy who developed packet switching, and it's a pretty hilarious part of the hearings because it's like you could kind of picture him looking at them like the way Zuckerberg looked at Orrin Hatch that time, like Senator, we sell ads. And Barron's is like, I'm sorry, are you guys thinking, are you talking about building a building to store data? Because it doesn't matter whether you build a building, like we're connecting all the computers up. Like we don't need a building. Like pretty soon the data will just be in a cloud. Like, I don't think you understand what computer data is and what the storage issues are, because we're turning computers into communications devices. So here's what you should really, I don't care whether you build a building or don't build a building. It's kind of a stupid question, Congressman. But here's what you should be doing is, and I hope you are doing, is thinking about regulations about who owns data and how it can be used. And because this will be like probably your last chance, because we really, the horse is going to be out of the barn really soon. And Arthur Miller, who, as a very young man, testified before the Senate, and he said, oh yeah, it's going to be destroy people's privacy if you build the National Data Center. And so when I interviewed him, he said, like, Jesus, I mean, by 1971, we realized, like, what were we thinking? Like, that was our last best chance to have any kind of rules about data, you know, because then you get to 74 and it's like all about the government. And it's like, but like if there had been government guidelines that were self-adopted, you know, in 67, 68, or, you know, it would have set up a framework for, you know, governance over and regulation of corporate-owned data. And it just never, because people just kind of couldn't get their heads around it, which I mean, I'm super sympathetic with. But you hear, you know, you see people who are in the know, like this MIT guy who's the chairman of the research board of Simulmatics, who says in 1968, you know, in 50 years' time, I could sit at my desk and I could find out anything about anybody without ever leaving the room. Like all the computers will be connected. I could find out anybody's criminal record, their high school transcripts, their employment record, whether someone in their household has ever been on federal government assistance. You know, I could find out anything just to let you know. But I'm not sure that I should be able to do that. And we'll have to see what they think. And it's like, wait a minute, why didn't you figure it out? Like, if you guys had figured it out, like, why did you just kick that can down the road? Like, we haven't figured it out. It's 50 years ago. Couldn't you have done, like, so it's fascinating to me how I kept bumping into that, like with the Newton Minow letter, like people who are like, oh, this could be pretty bad. I wonder what will happen. And then they keep doing it.
I know. It's the more you look at the you know, the history of the computer privacy debate, the more you're like, oh well, the horse like left the barn so long ago. I should, you know, not worry so much about my iPhone settings. I'm going to turn to some of the some questions that are coming in from the audience and encourage folks to post questions if you have questions that you'd like to bring into the conversation. But before we do that, I really want to bring in the women in the story in your book and talk more about gender in tech. This is a very, you know, the men behind this company and the politicians who are kind of making choices about these things. It's all white men, and yet there are women in this story too. And kind of what do you think this longer history helps us see about the terrain of gender and tech over the long term?
Yeah. I mean, you know, the sexual politics of the 1950s faculty marriage are very terrifying to get close to. Like if you've ever seen Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you know, the Edward Albee play, it's kind of that. Like they're drinking, there's affairs, it's people are brutal to one another. Minnow McPhee writes to her mother, these men treat their wives like dirt. I mean, she's just shocked. And she's in a very terrible marriage herself. But these look even worse to her. You know, they're very smart women with completely thwarted intellectual ambitions. A number of them go back and finish their education. Almost all the marriages fall apart, except for the MIT professor who has a very strong marriage with a woman who has a PhD and this incredibly interesting marriage of a partnership. But that's the exception. All the other marriages, pretty much all the other marriages, fall apart. And the families fall apart, many of them over Vietnam. But the bad bargain is, you know, the men pursue with I think, very kind of painful ruthlessness, like painful to them. They're great, like the whole culture is telling them they're geniuses all the time. which is kind of, a crazy burden that, I can't imagine. No one ever thought. I was, you know what I mean? Like the idea that someone would expect stuff of you is bizarre to me. But they're very much baffled by their wives and their children, and it comes across in their correspondence. It's a very, it really is that Mad Men world, right? and you see the Betty Draper like explosive inwardness. And it's that, and except that these men are going out to build a machine to understand how humans think and feel and would behave. And they don't understand their wives, and they don't understand their children. And some of this irony is not lost on people. Like Minnow McPhee has a sister-in-law, who's always writing to her husband, to Minnow's husband, Bill McPhee, who's the guy who really wrote the code, saying like, your whole work is about this, trying to like predict human behavior. You cannot even predict what your wife is going to say to you, because you don't understand anybody in the world. Like, you just don't understand human beings. And there's something about that just feels very painfully resonant with a certain sort of Silicon Valley figure today. A kind of isolated individual, a certain kind of man who's uncomfortable with women, maybe doesn't feel, may have a family, maybe doesn't feel like he totally gets them, much more comfortable with machines and coding. And, that's fine. Like, there's, 1,000 flowers shall bloom. People can be, in many different ways. But should you hand the tools of our communications infrastructure to those particular people? Like, it's that, like, that's crazy making. And even in cases where, Minnow McPhee had studied child development, which was a new field, a really exciting revolutionary field in the 1940s. And, if you've ever spent time in a nursery school or talked to a nursery school teacher, there's not really another category of person that better understands human development and can predict human behavior than a nursery school teacher. And yet that is not knowledge. Like, to these people, that is the most demeaned and pathetic of things. And she knows that. Like, anytime she goes to sometimes sit in on the seminars, and she says, I don't have a PhD. I don't understand this stuff. It's like, you know what? You do probably understand it. You probably understand that it's crap. Like, but she doesn't have the confidence. Like, so it's anguishing, to see, hear all these guys trying to get a computer to think like them. And they have this, this rational choice model of the social sciences that all actors are, as in, like, well, that they come to believe that you could get a machine to think like a person because their model of who a person is themselves. It's like they're trying to build a machine that is Mr. Spock or something. You know what I mean? Like, as opposed to the idea that the human mind is metaphorically a computer is, to me, an absurdity. But to them, it seems altogether natural. And that has to do with that particular sexual politics of the era. And we live in that, we're trapped in the machine that they built.
Yeah. But it persisted. I mean, there's so many parallels to the sexual politics, obviously, of the early Silicon Valley. Plenty of women in tech then. They were just mostly the wives who were staying home, making sure everything else worked, and also the women who were on the assembly line and doing all sorts of other pretty critically important jobs. And
all the immigrant women building all the electronics.
Yeah. It was a manufacturing industry for a very long time. I mean, that it's a, your guys were doing software kind of before it was an industry, and Silicon Valley itself was hardware until, through the 1980s, really, pretty much. It's interesting too, thinking about the, of course, the personal computer industry comes from a movement of a personal computer movement of the sort of late 60s, early 70s, of a generation that is kind of against the Vietnam generation. This is the Vietnam generation that's pushing against the Simulmatics generation, and wanting to, and interestingly, that a whole cluster of a subset of that personal computer community in the Bay Area was focused on education, and particularly early childhood education. Men and women who were like, computers are going to be the tool to revolutionize education, and this is going to be extraordinary. And they really, first of all, there's part of that becomes commercialized, that the education business, computers in schools, is a very big chunk of business for companies like Apple then and now. But it really, those idealists, and particularly the women, some of whom were teachers, but men and women who were teachers who were really interested in using computers and integrating that in education in a very progressive way, they kind of fall out of the picture. They aren't the ones making the companies and making the bucks. So it's sort of the what if moments. I think there are a lot of what if moments in your book that come out that, so we have some sort of questions. One of the questions that are coming in, thinking about this sort of connection between the raw data and the biases of the people who are designing the software and the hardware, and then a question about I'm going to kind of answer, and you ask a question that's kind of interesting about models. Models are created by humans, so we do not understand ourselves enough. How the sort of models don't predict elections. And I think one of you talk in the book about how, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the Simulmatics does work for the Kennedy campaign. A lot of the things that their model predicts actually turn out to be campaign tactics that Kennedy uses and are seen as instrumental success. Whether those were the reasons the campaign did that is not necessarily clear. But the belief that a model, that you can kind of plug information into a computer and actually how it plays out. We have a lot of examples from Simulmatics all the way to Cambridge Analytica that it's not really clear that all of this privacy intrusion and this data stripping is resulting in providing the results that the models predict. So why do we keep on doing it? Why the fascination with these tools and these machines? Why do they have such a hold on how so many things operate, and why is the answer often a technical one?
Yeah, I mean, I do think a lot of it is snake oil, and you can just sell this stuff to people who are desperate to figure out how to gain an advantage in a campaign, whether it's an advertising campaign or a propaganda campaign or a political campaign. So I myself, I'm not. So I don't know enough to know, for instance, did Cambridge Analytica really make a difference in the Trump campaign or in the Brexit campaign in 2015? There is research there, but I haven't looked at it. I don't have a ready-made answer for that. I certainly think a great deal of it is bullshit. Like if you read the the stock offerings of all kinds of predictive analytics companies, the stuff that they promise to be able to predict, like, I'm just like, really? I don't think so. But people will buy it because they're scared. Uncertainty is difficult. We have made a vast cultural turn over the course of the 20th century to really believing in prediction. I was sitting on the back porch this morning with my husband, and we have a new puppy who peed on the rug, and we had the rug in the backyard. And I said, I think it's going to rain. We should bring the rug in. And he said, it's not going to rain. And I looked at the sky, and he looked at his phone. And I was like, it's going to rain. He's like, it's not going to rain. But we expect things to be predictable. It's some piece of the, I think, profound despair of this moment is not just the loss and the grief and the suffering, but it's the uncertainty, the just a continued uncertainty. I mean, between all the climate change stuff that's going on, the terrible suffering, and the pandemic and the political chaos. We have grown very accustomed to having a pretty good idea of stuff that's going to happen next. And I don't think we generally do have that pretty good idea. But meanwhile, I think we haven't attended to the way in which the expectation that our models are accurate is itself potentially a poisonous one. And this was the big critique of Simulmatics in the 1960s. A political philosopher from the University of California, Berkeley, Eugene Burdick, who had been asked to work for the company and had declined, wrote a political dystopian novel about the company. And his point as a political philosopher, a political theorist, was the real problem with micro-targeting voters with your message is that's not how a republic works. We are actually supposed to cast votes in which we exercise our civic virtue and think about the common good and the common weal and the public interest. And if the only messages we ever get are directed to us personally and our own personal and private interests and individual experience of the economy and society and the political order and the laws of the land, then we will cast bad votes. Mm-hmm. We will come to hate our fellow citizens because we'll consider ourselves to be always in competition with them, person by person by person, for the securing of our personal interests. And while that is part of a liberal democracy, the other part of it is all of us are also supposed to be thinking about everyone. And what will happen to political discourse if all of our political campaigns are run by simulations that work on the on the hyper individual level, that's just corrosive of the very nature of our political system. It's completely inconsistent with it, right? It's a little bit like Uber deciding we can provide faster, cheaper ride service. And someone might have said, even at the time, you picture someone in the board meeting said, wow, it's going to really screw up pollution and traffic. Like, you guys are going to destroy cities. But they'd be like, yeah, but we can deliver faster and cheaper travel services. Like, you kind of picture like someone at the Simulmatics scene, but wait, this is completely inconsistent with our system of representative government in a republic. But we could get really good election advice and sell it to a campaign for money. Like that, it's that moment that, and in so much of, your work and people who are critical of some of the ethical stuff in Silicon Valley, or, Facebook is by far the biggest, the gorilla kind of case here, like not having any concern for all the incredibly irreplaceable institutions that will be destroyed by the pursuit of this business model. Yeah. So we still live in a world where that's how those decisions are being made.
Yeah, that your comments there really wrapped up, I think, several of the questions that are out there about this question of what is the consequence of atomization, and where does the republic go from here? Where does the world go from here? And maybe kind of to sort of wrap us up and bring us together, thinking about these, yesterday there was the White House had a conference on American history, in which the president announced formation of a commission to kind of to talking about sort of a patriotic education for children in schools. But really we're in the middle of a debate, not only about, among many things, among other things, we're debating around history. And this question of sort of a story that brings everyone together is very alluring and I think probably essential. I think one of the things you show in this book is the slicing and dicing does not achieve the sort of, does not get us where we need to go, and it has a longer history. So what are your, kind of can you take us out on some words of, just thoughts of, thinking about the coming together after the splitting apart? What would be required, and where might tech fit into that story?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to try to steer myself towards something about coming together. But I was struck, you may have read the same stories about climate change scientists offering their sympathies to epidemiologists, saying, now you guys know what it feels like to have done your life of research, and people who have vested interests have discredited your work, even though your work is very well established. I feel sometimes like the historians could say to the climate change scientists and to the epidemiologists, we know your pain. Like, we have been there for a really long time. Like, the history wars go really far back. The attempt to have the federal government decree what is the true story of America is an evergreen. And to do that is to deny the integrity of historical inquiry as a humanistic discipline. We are a discipline with a method. Like, there are things you discover in the archives that tell you things, and there are things that other historians have deliberately ignored that have to be found and brought out and told. And the same way that there is evidence of glaciers falling into the sea in the Arctic, or the numbers that the CDC has reported are actual real numbers. So I think it's kind of useful and maybe helpful to understand that what we had maybe thought of as a separate set of political campaigns of intellectual evisceration, you know, a kind of a particular agenda to destroy the authority of the university, to destroy the authority of science, to destroy the authority of the liberal legal academy and liberal courts, to destroy the authority of the press and a free and independent press. Like, history is just like one of those things on the list, and now also so are the biological sciences and the earth sciences. So I think that's a lot of people who can actually come together, and I think that the case it desperately needs to be made and can be made, that ideas matter, that it counts to stand up and defend the integrity of your discipline to the public. But I think what has been, you know, made undeniably clear is that people who work in higher education need to be out there defending people who do K through 12 education and standing alongside them, and not let, you know, Trump beat up high school and 6th grade teachers to do some kind of flag waving nonsense. That's just, it's a non-thing, this commission. It's not an actual thing. There are actual things, you know, there are people who are suffering. There are stories that need to be told. There are books that need to be written and read. And there are Zoom calls that need to come to a close, and there are town halls that need to be, you know, resettled, and places that need to be kindled and nurtured and supported. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and for your support for this town hall, this organization, and this bookstore. It really makes a tremendous difference, and it's a time of great severe crisis for the world of ideas, and everything that you do really does help. So, and I also just want to thank you, Margaret, because it's been super fun. We should talk more.
Really fun. This is great. We should take this show on the road or on the Zoom road or something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming virtually to Seattle, and I'll let our host take us out.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Jill. Before we leave, the questions were really starting to flow fast and furious at the end, and let that be a lesson to everyone that get them in early so that we can get to as many as possible. I do want to note that there were a couple that were starting to emerge around attacks on tech or simplifications of issues around tech. And so what I would say to a couple of the people who noted that is take a look at the rest of our calendar, and you'll find lots of talks that from tech professionals and from sort of tech specialists, if you will, who go into deep conversations around issues from a specifically sort of tech perspective. And I find it refreshing tonight to have the perspective of two acclaimed historians sort of in coming at this world with the curiosity that informed lay people from outside of a sector can bring. So I just wanted to make sure that didn't go sort of unnoticed. We're not trying to avoid any controversy here or controversy. I also want to say that anybody who enjoyed tonight's event, check out, come back and join us tomorrow night for the New Truth, Jill's event with Hanson Hossein. And as I mentioned at the top, there is a code you can use, Truth10, TRUTH 10. It's been a long week. And the number 10, and that'll get you $10 off tomorrow night's ticket. Also buy a copy of the book, please, if you haven't already. If then, from our good friends at Finney Books, using that green buy the book button at the bottom of the page. Margaret and Jill, thank you so much for spending your Friday evening with us. It means more than I can express. And we will see you all again virtually. And to Jill's point, I sure hope actually sometime very soon at Town Hall. Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.